Welcome to the Bhagavata Podcast. I'm Måns Broo, a senior lecturer at Åbo Academy University in Finland and a senior research fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. I'll be a host for this podcast inspired by the work of the Gaudiya Studies research project at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. This podcast is a series of discussions on chapters of the Bhagavata Purana, a classic text of Vaishnava philosophy, sacred law, and profound ritual traditions. What makes this podcast unique? Every guest here is not only a trained scholar of Indology and related disciplines, but also a dedicated Vaishnava practitioner. This blend of rigorous academic scholarship and lived devotion allows us to explore the Bhagavata Purana through a rare and insightful lens. Here, theology is not just theory, it is scholarship in dialogue with faith. And to honor that, my guests and I will embrace Vaishnava tradition fully, including wearing the sacred marks of the tradition and using our Vaishnava names. Thank you for joining us for the Bhagavata Podcast. Narayanam namaskritya naram chaiva narottamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayamudiraye. Welcome to the very first episode of this new podcast, dealing with the Bhagavata Purana or the Srimad Bhagavata, a central text of Vaishnava Hinduism. In this podcast, we aim at illuminating various aspects of this text and also opening it up for perhaps new readers. This is a fascinating text of central importance for many Hindu schools, but it's also a challenging text to read. Today, I have a very special guest. And the idea of this podcast is each time we'll have different guests. Today, I'm joined by Shaunaka Rishi, the director of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. He has been with the center from its very beginning. And he's also a person who has been engaging with this Bhagavatam for many, many years. I think you told me once, Shaunaka, that the first time you read the Bhagavatam was in 78, is that correct?
79, near enough.
Fair enough. How was it to read the Srimad Bhagavatam in the 70s?
Well, I suppose I was 18 years old. I just bumped into this text. I had joined an ashram and was beginning to practice, and this was one of the main texts, but it was very philosophical, very dense. But there were a lot of pictures. I learned an awful lot because each picture associated itself with a verse. And by looking at the picture and the verse, I started to get it. And so I gradually started to delve in and, begin to realize, okay, this is actually quite a deep text. And one of the first verses that I read, it was in the third Canto, the third book. It started by saying, thus consciously engaged in spirituality. And I realized for the first time that religion, spirituality, it is not something you're born into. It's not something you take up kind of just on a Tuesday evening and give it up on a Wednesday morning. But this was something that you're consciously engaged in. Now, when an Irishman in the 70s joined an ashram, a word that no one knew in Ireland, my mother, for instance, she was quite convinced I'd joined a cult and I had been coerced, brainwashed, influenced in nebulous ways. But I was reading this text, realizing that, no, this is a very conscious, thoughtful book. It's asking me to become more thoughtful and more conscious, more willingly engaged. And I had to apply myself. And that's when I started to read it more purposefully. And when I did read it, I was, I mean, some of it was just way above my head. Philosophically, it's like you need a degree of some kind, or at least a dictionary. But there were some verses really caught my attention. Not only caught my attention, but really explained the kind of spiritual path I was pursuing, and opened it up to me in much deeper ways than I had actually imagined. It was many years later that I was really surprised to find that it wasn't just the denomination that I had joined of Vaishnavism, but it wasn't only Vaishnavas that were finding this, but all the different religions of India were engaging with this text. And some of them were quite contrary to each other in terms of their conclusion. So again, that again opened up the text to me as, wow, how come this appeals to so many people? You know, I read it and I think, well, the obvious conclusion is a Vaishnav conclusion, it's a personal God, etc. But that wasn't everyone's conclusion. Yet they still found the dynamic text. So so in the beginning it was a slow burn until I got up the courage to read it, because it's about 15,000 words, verses, you know. And then each verse has a commentary. It's a journey. And then you realize that I think, are there 60 commentaries of the Bhagavad Purana? The Mahabharata has 2. You know, this is one of the most, everyone writes a commentary, a huge, voluminous purport, an idea of an Acharya is giving us an idea. What is this text saying? And so many people have an opinion about what it's saying. That's fascinating that they're all attracted to this text. So yeah, no, there's been from that first little chink, those first few words, a whole universe has opened up.
So it's about 14,000 or 15,000 verses. Every verse has multiple commentaries. This does sound quite daunting.
Well, I think thankfully I didn't know that when I was young. It became more daunting, you know, after I'd read it for the first time. I didn't even know it after I'd read it for the first time, which took a long time. But as I became aware of it, I just began to realize, what have I read? It means that I wasn't really, what was I reading? And what were all these commentators reading? And they were all saying different things, but they weren't as different as I thought they were. They were looking at the same thing from a different angle of vision. And that again opened up a whole world of possibility. Up to that point, I think I had thought that a scripture was a book that just told you how it was, and it was straightforward and simple, and then you just did what it said, more or less. But this was a different book. It was inspiring me to think differently, and everyone was thinking differently and thinking deeply and thinking broadly. So their thinking was inspiring my thinking, whether I agreed with them or not. And then I'd go back to the text to contemplate it yet again and find a completely different meaning. I think that's only healthy. I think that's the healthiest way to approach anything in life. But I think especially spiritual life, because it means it's alive. There's a vibrancy about it. I mean, it must be your experience. You know, we looking at each other, we both have the grey hairs. We've been around a bit, but I look back in my 20s and think, even in my 30s, I look back in my 20s and thought, oh, I was so stupid then, I didn't understand anything. And then in my 40s, I look back in my 30s and say, oh, that was so mature. And in my 50s, I look back in my 40s and go, look, what was I thinking? And in my 60s, I'm looking back at my 50s and it's the same. So, you know, we're on a constant journey of learning. If we're not learning, we're dead. We have to reassess. And all these commentaries and all these sadhus and all these acharyas and all these academics who study the Bhagavad and look into the history, the social context, it's all valuable to read it from many angles of vision and really question it. You know, I have to question it myself. I have to question myself as the reader. I have to question, who am I reading the text? You know, what's my qualification? So the starting point is I don't have one. You know, it's just, when we come to the second verse of the first chapter, it's Yes, let's go to the second verse of the first chapter. If I can find it in this book on my lap, it says Dharma Prayojita Kaiva Totra. And it says that this completely rejecting all religious activities that are materially motivated. Then it starts talking about what this verse is, or what this text is, what this whole book is. And just reading that, completely rejecting all religious activities that are materially motivated. Well, for me, at the time as a young man, the religion I was brought up with, the religion I understood, was I go to a place of worship, I ask God for stuff, God gives me stuff, I don't give him very much in return, and walk out a happy man. And that's the program. I ask God for a BMW and I expect him to give me one. I don't know any car dealer who's going to give me a car if I ask him for it for free. So this is not considering that at all. It's completely rejecting that. And again, that's pause for who am I to read this book? Or consequently, how will I read this book? What do I expect to get out of it? Well, it's not going to be a BMW, obviously, or exam results or great prestige or a wonderful wife or whatever we're looking for. So this is rejecting all of that. And this is the second text of the whole book. So it's really putting it into context. This is a book not about materially motivated religion, which it recognizes, but it's rejecting it for the purpose of what we're going to talk about going forward. So then I have to reject it if I want to be someone who is allowing myself to access the book. If I approach the book otherwise, I won't really have access. It's like an Irishman like myself going to the heavenly world and looking for the Guinness bar. No one's interested in Guinness in the spiritual world where everything is joy and bliss without having to get sozzled. If I want a Guinness bar, I go back to Dublin, where I'll be happy. So this book is not for any expectation like that. But that really put it into my mind, what is it for then? What is this book for? That became the, and that's, we go back to the first verse. Now the first verse, as we would say in Ireland, there's eating and drinking in the first verse. It's a whole thing in itself. It has been said that it's a collection of sutras. It's like a mini book of sutras, just that verse. Janmadhyasya yataho. That is the second verse of the Vedanta Sutra. That just those three words. They're the first three words of that. And so it's starting by saying this Vedanta Sutra, this is what we are going to explain to you now. This whole book is a commentary on those sutras. A sutra is a saying that's so compact that you have to unpack it. You have to go to someone and ask them, what does this mean? It's kind of a little reminder. The words are just little reminders, little notes. And then you contemplate it and it opens up into a whole universe of understanding. So it's talking about Janmadhyasya yatha. It's talking about how to understand the absolute truth, how to understand Brahman, how to understand what's real, what's big. That's what it's alluding to. Just those few words. That's a huge subject. And it's opening that up. And then the verse goes on to open it up more and more and more. But what it is saying quite clearly is that it's talking about the subject matter is about God and is about the spiritual self and the relationship. That's clearly what it's about. And it ends Satyam Param Dhimahi. And it's talking about the ultimate truth. That's what we're going to meditate on. But the word Dhimahi is a Vedic word. It's the Rig Vedic word. So it's now connecting to the Rig Veda. So it's saying that everything the Rig Veda is talking about, that the Vedanta Sutra is synthesizing, this book is going to resolve this for you. We're going to meditate on that ultimate truth. That's what this book is about. And the next verse saying, we're completely rejecting materially motivated religion. So God is not, in this context, God is not a material thing. He's not a football for us to speculate about. God. I think God is quite detached from the world, really. I don't think God cares. No, God is a person. He cares very much. And we're all just making it up as we go along. It's just the God we would like there to be. This is saying, no, we're going to inquire into God. We're going to investigate this more thoroughly. But we're completely rejecting the material side of religion, the acquisitive side. We're not interested in greed. We're not interested in power. We're not interested in lust or anger. These things leave aside. We're moving on. I suppose the third verse, I think, helps us understand it's about Shukadeva Goswami and his qualification to speak on this subject, and that this is where we're getting this from. Now, it's ultimately not where we're getting it from. We're getting it from Lord Vishnu, who recites 4 verses to Lord Brahma, and that's the Bhagavat. And Lord Brahma gets it because he's a very intelligent chap. And he gives those 4 verses to Narada, his son, and then he gives those 4 verses to Vyasa, who's the author of the text. And then Shukadeva Goswami is listening to his father Vyasadeva, the author, and he's fascinated by this, and he then recites it to Suta Goswami. So this is a lineage of people, and Shukadeva is expanding on the 4 verses to explain it. And then Suta Goswami comes into the forest of Naimisharanya, where the sages have all gathered, 1,000 sages have gathered to consider what's the best thing for the world. What's the best thing we can do to serve the world? And what's the greater good? And how can we contribute? And Suta Goswami comes into the assembly, and he's practically the youngest sage among them, but they have such regard for him that they ask him to come and speak and share. What do you think? And he says, oh, well, listen, I've just come from listening to Shukadeva Goswami. And Suka is a parrot, and he's repeating the words of Vyasa. So that's why he has that name. So then Suta Goswami says, I've just heard this wonderful recitation. Let me share it with you. And as he shares it, of course, he's commenting on it again. So the Bhagavatam gets bigger, and eventually we end up with 14,500 verses. So the commentarial tradition begins right at the start. The idea that this is a book to be expanded. It's ever expanding. That's the health of it. That's why it's dynamic. That's why it's alive. And we have to keep it alive by continuing to expand rather than maybe make it a mausoleum of scripture. To say that this is the scripture, you don't question it, you don't philosophize about it, you just accept it for what it is. Because once you start reading the first verse, you have no idea what it is. It's not straightforward. It forces you to think. And so the beginning of verse 3 is, O expert and thoughtful men, relish this Srimad Bhagavatam, the mature fruit of the desire tree of Vedic literatures. So it's saying this thoughtful people, that's who we want to come. You have to come and think about this, because this book is the mature fruit of everything you've heard before. It's the natural commentary on the Upanishads, on the Vedas, etc. So, and that's just the first 3 verses, and I'm just really skimming over. I've just quoted the first line of each. We haven't even got into it, shall we say?
That's beautiful, Shaunaka. That's beautiful. And I think what you began with, this way in which the Bhagavata rejects all kind of cheating, materially motivated religion. That's something that's very, very visible in the text itself, because the Bhagavata, it is of course a Purana as well. It follows the style and the general themes of a Purana. It will deal with things like creation, secondary creation, maintenance, stories of kings, and so on. But it does so in a completely different way than all the other Puranas. It begins in the same way, like you mentioned, Sutta and the sages there in Naimisharanya. Every Purana begins in the exact same way. The sages go up to Sutta and they ask questions, and then he starts speaking, and then they ask more, and then they get into stories, and there's stories within stories within stories. And that's, of course, one of the things that makes this text not always so easy to grasp. So in one sense, the Bhagavata looks exactly like other Puranas, but then some things are completely different. And this dharma projita kaitavotra, that here all this kaitava or cheating religion is rejected. That comes through very clearly in how in other Puranas there'll always be so much discussion about how to do this to get this, how to do this to atone for that sin, how to all these things that you mentioned, how to get a beautiful wife and well-behaved children and so on. Bhagavatam doesn't deal with any of that. It goes directly to this satyam param, this highest truth. I personally find the beginning of the Bhagavatam to be very exciting. These 3 verses that you mentioned, they are so kind of dense and full of philosophy. Then from there we get to Naimisharanya. I hope somebody, OCHS or somebody else does a movie on the Bhagavatam, or maybe a TV series on the Bhagavatam. And I visualize the beginning as you see these Himalayan views, and you hear these verses kind of in a booming voice. Janma yasya yato nayadidaratas, or something like that. And then the camera goes from the Himalayas to this big forest, and you just see the tops of the trees from above. And then you see this smoke coming up between the trees. And then the camera focuses in there on this fire. There's this sacrificial fire. The sages sitting there and doing their offerings. And the Bhagavatam, it says here in the first chapter that they're engaged in 1,000-year sacrifice. And they're doing it to counteract the bad effects of the present age. And of course, they can't do that because time cannot be stopped. So they're engaged in this kind of hopeless task of trying to turn time back. And they realize that, and instead they go up to Sutta and they say, we want to know some things. I brought with me one, and I'll just let you speak. I'll just say one more thing. I brought a book with me. It's called the Sri Bhagavata Samlapa. It's by Swami Bhakti Pradik Tirtha. He was a godbrother he was a disciple of Bhakti Vinod Thakur, actually, and sannyasi disciple of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Prabhupada's guru. And in this book, he's collected kind of discussions of the Bhagavatam. And I find it helpful because, for example, he isolates 6, or he analyzes the first chapter as being 6 questions of the sages, headed by Shaunaka. The main of the sages is Shaunaka Rishi. So Shaunaka Rishi and the others, they ask 6 questions of Sutta Goswami. And then in the next chapter, he's going to reply to them. But from your reading, is there anything that kind of stuck in your mind regarding these questions that they start out with?
Well, I did kind of write out. I wrote down the questions for myself. So let's just go through them. The first is, what is the ultimate good for humanity? Shreyas Pumsam. Second is, what is the essence of all spiritual knowledge? But it's interesting that they start off by saying, what is the ultimate good for all humanity? There's a real compassion about what they're trying to do. What is the essence of all spiritual knowledge? And again, maybe interesting. They're not saying what's the best religion. No, it's what's the essence of spiritual knowledge. It's a very open question, and they're interested in whatever the answer or answers could be. The third is why did Krishna appear in the world? So they want to know. So Krishna has just left when the Bhagavatam starts, and they're fascinated by Krishna, and they want to know why did Krishna come? He's like such a character, such a person. Explain Krishna to us, and for what are God's activities in relation to creation? So how is he interacting with this creation? And the fifth is what are the stories of in each avatar? When God does manifest in the world, tell us those stories, because they must be very instructive. And the sixth is, to whom have religious principles gone since the departure of Krishna? So Krishna for them was such a significant figure that if he left, then religion must have left. I mean, everything is falling apart. And that's why Kali Yuga is starting. So they're asking these questions. So they're very, in a sense, they're kind of innocent questions. There's no agenda in them. They're not closed questions. They're very open-ended questions. We ask closed questions. We want an answer that we're trying to shape the answer. So which is better, Hinduism or Christianity, or being Irish or being American? we're tempting the person. But no, these are very broad-minded, and even though they're simple questions, they're very deep questions. They're very significant questions. But the start, they're 3 times in the first chapter, they're expressing concern for the ultimate good, for the good of all living entities. And that, I think that's very instructive for us, that, why are they assembled there? Doing, as you say, the impossible, attempting to, keep time at bay, and the ravages of Kali Yuga and everything. And again, in this first chapter, at the end, they specifically say that they're very disturbed by the idea that the winter of the ages is beginning. I'm beginning to sound like someone from the Game of Thrones now.
Winter is coming.
The winter is coming, yeah. But they're very concerned that things are going to change and change badly. How do we ameliorate the worst effects of this? Is there anything we can do to help? So that it's just wonderful that they say that. There is one thing that struck me as well in the first chapter. They specifically refer to the divine attributes of the name of God, the Nam, and it's just I really hadn't struck me in the same way before. It was just there's a number of things that it mentions, but it mentions this because when we go to the 12th canto, the last chapter, and practically the last verse, it comes back to the name and recommends that we take this name seriously. The chanting of this name, the meditation on this name, the remembrance of this name is going to be the shining light that will illuminate the darkness and really help us. It's a sadhana, it's a spiritual practice. So it's recommending a spiritual practice in the first and last chapter. And again, the last chapter is it's a famous verse, but I hadn't noticed it here. And so anyway, that was just, it actually recommends a sadhana in the first chapter. And then after it goes through the whole of the Bhagavatam, in the end, it reinforces it very strongly. But they planted the seed at the very beginning. And this was coming from the sages before any of the questions were really formulated and before the answers were given. They were already realizing that, in the age of Kali, at least this is possible. All the different sacrifices, the fire sacrifices, all the yajnas, all the austerities you can perform, the yogic meditation that you can't do in this age. We can't sit still for 5 minutes. All those things may fall by the wayside, but anyone can chant or anyone can listen to the chanting. So they're kind of saying at least this can be done. And for them, it kind of might sound like the lowest common denominator, where for us, it's a tremendous boon. It's like, it's a really big deal. But I hadn't noticed before that it's mentioned in the first and the last chapter. And I think that's actually very significant.
Yeah, I mean, I also hadn't noticed that, so I'm happy to hear that. I've learned something new. But one thing that I have been thinking about is how another way in which the Bhagavatam really differs from other Puranas is in terms of its composition. Among scholars, Puranas don't have a very, very kind of, they're not known for their literary merits. They're supposed to be repetitive and hyperbolic and so on. But the Bhagavatam, of course, is written also in a very, very kind of consciously literary style, using lots of different meters, lots of different figures of speech and so on. So for the author to really kind of have thought about how to begin the text and then to tie that to the end, that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking about two things I wanted to ask you. One is these sages, Shaunaka and the others, by now they're supposed to have heard all the other Puranas. This is the last of the Puranas. How much do they already know about the things they're asking? Are they asking for things that they know already, or do you feel that they're ready to hear something new? That's the first question.
Yeah, I mean, the tone of their questions, how they frame their questions, I think really helps us understand that these people are very sincerely inquiring. They're still sincerely inquiring. They're not satiated. They're not jaded with all they've heard. In a sense, they're not satisfied. They're still asking the basic question: what's the thing we can do for the good of all humanity? When you hear a Purana who says, if you want, these wonderful material things, then do this, do this, do this. I can understand that these sages aren't thinking like that. They're ready to up their game. And that's what Sutta is sharing with them. He's saying, oh, wow, I've just heard this. I've just had this conversation with Shukadeva Goswami, and you wouldn't believe what he proposes. Let me share it with you. And it becomes a completely different conversation. I think the other thing, and I'm jumping the gun here because this doesn't happen in this chapter, but of course we know that this happens in the context of Maharaj Parikshit, who's going to die in 7 days, and he has questions to ask, and all the sages are allowing him to ask these questions, and be satisfied and be reconciled to his fate. So there's an urgency and maybe a poignancy, and I think that's also significant, that part of the setting, because this isn't about, it's not pedestrian, we're just having a chat about religion per se. No, we're talking in the company of someone who's going to die in 7 days. Now tell me what spiritual life is. Now tell me what religion is. Now tell me what the relevance of Krishna's appearance is, or any of these questions. Now tell me what's for the best of humanity. I think it was Dr. Samuel Johnson. He was the man who compiled the first English dictionary. He was on his deathbed and said someone came in to talk to him about something, and he looked at them and he said, death greatly concentrates the mind, which was kind of telling them, I'm not interested in talking to you about these things, and I really think that context makes this Bhagavat much more focused, even for a reader who is somewhat pedestrian. When you touch this book and it's about someone facing death, you just have a little bit more respect. We're talking about serious stuff here. Why? Because we're all going to die. This is facing the reality of life head on. And now we're talking about real things. So we're rejecting material religion. We're really not interested. I think also that second chapter is deviating a little bit from what you said, but I think it's worth mentioning when the second chapter rejects materially motivated religion, it's also rejecting materially motivated commentary, materially motivated sharing, that we're sharing the Bhagavatam and we're pretending it's a book about something other than it is. I think it's inviting people to take it very seriously. And if you're going to comment on it, there has to be a certain quality. And the quality is not about the material context. We're only going to talk about the spiritual context. And if you're not interested or if you don't have much to say, then don't worry. You can listen. But if you're going to comment, you really have to have some substance, because Sutta Goswami could talk for so long about it because he really had something to say. But how many of us can speak in a purely spiritual context for 14,500 verses?
You're making me a bit scared now, Shaunaka. Are we qualified to access this text then? These are great sages, and I'm not a great sage.
No, but the thing is, we're voyeurs. We've been invited to read the text, study the text, contemplate the text, to be, in that sense, part of the conversation. And the thing is, if someone gives me a book on ballroom dancing, I have two left feet. I don't have much interest in ballroom dancing. I'm never going to be a ballroom dancer. It's not to my interest, so I'm not going to spend much time with it. And similarly, if someone gives someone a copy of this Bhagavatam and they flick through it and they think, no, I'm more interested in football, then be interested in football. You're not going to read the book. The fact is, I think you and I are still reading the book. I think that's the qualification. We're interested, we're fascinated, we're absorbed. It speaks to us. And I think that's anyone's qualification for getting involved in these books or any journey or any path, be it becoming an Olympian or becoming a Bhagavat, like you said, a follower of the Bhagavatam. And I think the mood of the sages, for me anyway, is very instructive. They're coming forward with their sincere inquiry. They seem a little naive and innocent, but they're actually very, very deep. And I think just coming forward with our sincere inquiry is qualification enough. That we're willing to ask and say, what is this? And I think that mode of approaching it, it's not about what religion I am, what my qualification is necessarily, if I'm a scholar or not. It's really not about that. I'm just interested to hear more about this. It sounds interesting. That is ultimately the qualification. And I think the rest grows on you. I mean, as I said, when I started reading, I was looking at the pictures. It sounds a little childish, but I'm dyslexic, so I don't immediately jump into reading a book. And I've learned techniques of how to do it and everything, but not a book like this. No one, you read the first two lines and you're already going, what? It takes you half a day to read a page just because it makes you think so much. So I think, why do I stick with a book like this? Well, it's the dyslexia hasn't been a problem. It's interest. It's a personal interest. I think that's the ultimate qualification.
Okay, that gives us some hope then. One thing that I was thinking about here in the first chapter is we have Shaunaka and the other sages, these big Brahmins who are qualified to perform this satra, this 1,000-year sacrifice. Interestingly, in I think it's the fourth verse, it said that they do this satra svargaya lokaya, to reach heaven. But the commentators, they explain that svargaya here should not be understood in the literal way as svarga, as heaven, but svargaya, the one who is glorified in heaven, that is Vishnu. So what's happened with these sages is they started out doing this sacrifice, maybe for material reasons, but by now doing the sacrifice, they've been purified and their motivation has changed. So perhaps for us as well, when we approach a text like this, our motivation can similarly change when we engage with it.
Absolutely, yeah. I totally agree. I totally agree with that. Yeah, I've seen that. You must experience that. I mean, no one sticks with anything unless they feel that they're changed by it. You know, you don't get into a fitness regime unless you end up feeling fit at some stage, week 3 or something like that. You know, you don't go on a diet unless you start losing weight. There has to be, you have to see what's happening. And I think it's the same with any scripture, with any piece of literature, a serious study. You have to begin to appreciate it more deeply, and feel it in your life, in yourself, in your person. Yeah. And the idea of, you said the Bhagavat, the Bhagavat is the person who is the book, and also the person who is reading the book, following the book, exploring the book. But that Bhagavat person has to begin to reflect the book, the qualities, the principles, the values, the virtues that are being discussed in the book have to start to manifest. Otherwise, the person isn't a Bhagavat. They're maybe a bag of fat. just a guy eating chips, watching football, who happens to read the Bhagavatam, but not transforming themselves. We have to actually transform.
Yeah.
And that's the same for any practice, material or spiritual. It's the same principle.
Another interesting thing is that these big Brahmins, they go to Suta to hear the Bhagavatam. Suta is not a Brahmin. He's a person from mixed background, which in traditional Indian society, all those centuries back, would be considered kind of less than a Brahmin. So there's a kind of transgressive aspect here at the very beginning, that they know that from a material point of view, we are superior, but when it really comes to something essential, this person, he's young, like you mentioned, he's a young man. He's younger, he has a different kind of background, but spiritually he's very much our superior. I think it's an interesting point.
No, that's a very good point. I think the Bhagavatam is very transgressive in the way you're mentioning. I mean, that's kind of a small point compared to some of the transgressions. So Prahlad is lecturing to his father. The wives of the Brahmins in the 10th canto are the heroes of the piece, who take Krishna seriously, where their husbands don't recognize who he is at all. And so everything in the Bhagavatam, not everything, but a lot, gets turned on its head. And so interestingly, I was talking to an Indian Christian friend of mine today, a reverend, and he was talking about, and it's a big thing in the Indian Christian community, that the caste system has to be abolished. And he was talking about it has to be abolished. And I was saying, well, no one's been successful at abolishing it. Maybe we have to approach it from another angle, because this is a good example. I said, it's been discussed in scripture, in Indian literature, for literally thousands of years. People have been questioning it. And here's another example of Suta, who's not a Brahmin, lecturing the Brahmins. Well, that's not the caste system. So where are we getting the caste system from? Valmiki wrote the Ramayana, and he wasn't a Brahmin, and he wasn't a Kshatriya, and he wasn't a Vaishya, and he wasn't a Sudra. He didn't even appear in the system at all, much like myself, as a white Irish guy. So, so where is the caste system? What is the caste system? I don't think we've really delved into the subject. If we want to talk about social justice and all these things, there's a lot to be seen in these texts that are commenting on these without commenting in a kind of a Protestant Christian way, is how we talk about these things generally these days. But the commentaries are there just by the story themselves, just by the setting, just by the fact that the sage that they put on the asan he doesn't appear in the social structure. It doesn't make any sense for them to put him on the ashram, but it does make sense spiritually, not socially, materially. but we have just rejected materially motivated religion. So now we're going to speak in a different way, and we're going to upend the social construct, and we're going to look at who's actually spiritually qualified, not materially qualified. And all of a sudden, everyone's playing a different role. And the father is instructing the son, and the animal is speaking and in a learned way to the human. The demon, Vritasura, is instructing Indra, the king of heaven, in a most humble, enlightened way, and encouraging him to do his duty, which is to kill Vrita. So the whole thing is topsy-turvy. Yet it makes sense because materially we see what's going on. Indra is trying to get rid of the evil Vrita, but Vrita is actually a spiritually advanced person who's stuck in an evil person's body, and he doesn't want it anymore. That blows our whole conception of religion and spirituality. It redefines everything. So the text is constantly redefining and upending our idea of gender. Gender, like Vishnu is all over the place, but then all of a sudden he pops up as Mohini Murti, a beautiful woman. Excuse me? So we're not getting into gender identity issues until the 21st century. But no, they're discussing it here in such a fluent way. It's just said in a story and it's not mentioned again. Yet if we go back to it, we find it very instructive. Why is the deity not taking gender identity seriously? Because somehow I'm a man, I take it very seriously. But then again, in my next life, could be a woman. So why am I taking it so seriously? Maybe I should be thinking of it that more clearly. But yeah, I think it's a really good point. It leads on to all kinds of issues that we're dealing with today. There are just simple little things like that give us a hint of what's to be taken seriously, what's real, what's worth putting energy into. And in the spiritual context, right at the very beginning, the person that they put on the asan to speak to them makes a huge statement about materially conceived religion and what has become the caste system and jati and everything that goes with it.
You mentioned, as you said, kind of jumping the gun with Parikshit, but and he is going to die in 7 days. Dying is maybe one of the central themes of the Bhagavatam. The late and much lamented Rick Jarrow, of course, has a book called Death and Dying in the Bhagavata Purana.
Very good book.
Would you call the Bhagavata a tragedy, or does it leave some hope for us?
Oh no, certainly. I mean, it's not a tragedy. It's interesting. I mean, now we're really jumping the gun. Now we've gone to the end of the Bhagavatam, and Parikshit goes into meditation after having heard everyone and being everything and being instructed so wonderfully. He goes into deep meditation on Krishna and shuts his eyes and closes down. His whole system shuts down, and the thought is that he has actually left. His body is just there. Now the curse was that he would be bitten by a snake. So this snake in a human form arrives and bites him on the foot. And its bite is so venomous, so poisonous, that the body immediately bursts into flames and just within instant it's just burned up. But it's not what kills him. He's already left. It's just a cremation. So the book is actually extremely hopeful. Now, even if Taksha, the snake, actually bit him and killed him, it's still the same hope, because the book is just, by the end, Parikshit is so detached from the world, so absorbed in the spiritual, so supported by all these sages who are just in a Californian way, sending all their vibes, and he's just bathing in good vibration. He's the most ready to go than anyone has ever been. He has more support than anyone else. The whole Naimisharanya becomes the hospice par excellence. But the idea is that no, he leaves of his own volition. He doesn't even wait for the curse. It's not even relevant to him anymore. The whole material context has become so irrelevant because he has something better. And that's the real message of the Bhagavatam, that, he has more than anyone else has ever acquired. Now, Parikshit, of course, is a king. He has all the wealth, he has all the beautiful wives and the wonderful children, and everyone loves him. But he's found something better. Now, for the rest of us, we're aspiring just to that, just to become a king, just to become a celebrity, to have a big car and to be on Instagram and all the stuff. That we're perfectly happy with that. But no, he wasn't happy with that anyway. He accepted the curse. He didn't reject the curse. He actually accepted it. He was perfectly willing to go through whatever it took to deal with this issue of death, because he understood, like any good philosopher in an Indian context, that death, contemplation of death, is the beginning of life. That's when you're really understanding what life is about and how to really lead your life in the most vibrant way, to be most alive and understand what's really important and what's not. So he achieved that. And I think that's wonderfully hopeful. For me, it's wonderfully hopeful. It's like, okay, if a king can do it, because a king is really attached to the material context, because he has things to be attached to. I think I'm attached, but I don't have anything. So, if he could do it, I can do it. We can all give it a go. So I think it's very hopeful because it's real. It's realistic. I've never gone to a party or a gathering where everyone's got their little glasses, chinking them together, and started to have a conversation about death. I've never successfully started a conversation about death at any such gathering where people are interested to listen. To be able to talk about real issues, the real issues of life, that's a gift. That's a blessing. That's to be among people who are willing to have that conversation. That's tremendous. So no, I think it's wonderfully positive. And I'm so happy you mentioned Rick Jara, who just passed away this year, and his wonderful work and his book. I think it's a book that everyone should dip. If you're interested in the Bhagavatam, this is a book well worth reading. And it's Rick is writing it as a scholar, but as I say, whatever commentary, whatever idea, perspective on the Bhagavatam, if we're really interested in the book, we should look at it really from every perspective. And I found great ideas and contemplation and angles, perspectives in Rick's book. Very thankful to him for that.
Thank you, Shaunaka. I think this one episode beautifully encapsulates the whole Bhagavatam. Maybe we don't need to do any more episodes. We've gone through everything already.
We went too far.
No, but thank you. I really liked the way in which you showed how relevant this text is, not just at the beginning of the Kali Yuga, but really to us and the kind of things that we're dealing with. Death, of course, is they call it the great equalizer, and I'm not so sure if that's actually true, but at least it's something that everyone has to go through. Just a final thing before we end, we're almost out of time. We're recommending the listeners to read for themselves the chapter that we're going to discuss before they listen to the podcast. So the next chapter is going to be the second chapter, obviously.
A wonderful chapter. I wish I had the second chapter.
Do you have any reading tips? Because it can be challenging if you're reading, for example, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's edition of the Bhagavatam. He has every single verse, first in Devanagari, then transcribed into Roman letters, then word by word translation. Then there's the translation, and then there's usually a purport or a commentary, which is usually so long, so when you finally finish the commentary, you don't remember what the verse was about. So it's a challenging read.
No, it really is. No, you're perfectly right. Well, what I did personally was I first read all the verses without reference to anything else, just to get the story, to get the gist.
The skipping the Sanskrit and everything.
Skipping the Sanskrit, the transliterations, the purports, the commentary. I just read the chapter, and then I understood. I thought I understood what I was reading, and then I went back and started to read the commentary, and it actually made sense then, because I had the gist of the chapter. I kind of knew where it was going. But it's exactly as you said. The first time I tried to read it, I was reading text, text and purport, and I got lost, because in that case, Bhaktivedanta Swami's edition. Now, I do know for some scholars it's the only edition that has the Sanskrit and the word for word and everything. So some scholars use it, but in the first three books. The first canto is the first book, really, but the first three sections. Bhaktivedanta Swami was an older man when he started translating it, and he didn't know if he had time to do the whole thing. And in the end, he didn't. He got as far as the middle of the 10th canto. But he tried to pack as much in the purports in an explanation. So they are quite long and they're quite dense. So I think to study it, I would definitely recommend just reading the translations, the texts themselves, the verses themselves, and then if you want, go back and do the purports, or even selectively do the purports, and then go, and the next reading do the other purports. So, but at least we should get through it eventually.
Yes.
Eventually, like that, you get through it and you do understand what was going on. Because, like you say, there are stories within stories. You can really get lost.
Thank you. I feel that so far, at least, you've kept us on track. And,
hey,
and
thank you.
Very thankful for your time. We had
to. Thank you. A great honor to just be able to talk about the book. It's just a wonderful book, wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.